Okay, can people hear me? Yes? Okay. Welcome, welcome. Please take a seat. This is the second of our events this morning. By the way, you'll notice that what we're discussing today, for those of you who were here last hour, we had faculty members who were talking about their research, and their research, in just a straightforward way, was clearly connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion on so many levels. They weren't thinking about that as part of their process. It just happens to them. That's what they're doing. And what we're going to do today is just have a conversation at a kind of a little bit more meta level about how diversity, equity, and inclusion has influenced our specific disciplines. And we have a great panel. John Bartlett from Fashion is here, right? Addrain Conyers from Criminal Justice, Stephen Garabedian from the Master of all Disciplines, History, and Lisa Stevens from Chemistry. I'm Nick I'm Nick Marshall. I'm from the History Department, right? And I was going to introduce this by talking about kind of how DEI has affected any number of things out there in the culture, not just academic disciplines. And one of them would have been how colleges are rethinking what equity means when it comes to financial aid. And many colleges have decided to try to re-understand it as fairness not being that each person will get financial aid of some sort, but each student will, in fact, not have to have a loan as they come out. And so the ideas about equity in terms of just paying for college are changing in ways that nobody would have thought about a few years ago. But what happened to me last night was, I think, another great example of how this has all worked out. So last night I went to Jill Lepore's talk at Dutchess Community College. Did anybody in the audience go see that? Okay. She's perhaps the most important and significant public historian perhaps today who writes for the, she's a Harvard professor. She writes frequently for the New Yorker. She's out there in the world as a historian talking about important things. And she gave a talk about amending the Constitution and why there have been these periods in American history when there have been these explosions of amendments, right after the Constitutional Convention, the Civil War amendments, the amendments that are associated with the Progressive era, and then those associated with the post-civil rights era in the early 70s, and how, in fact, it's become very difficult to amend the Constitution since then. And she thinks it's almost impossible now in the political climate to amend the Constitution. And one of the reasons she gives is because of the concept of originalism, right, which has become dominant among the Supreme Court justices about interpreting the Constitution through the original lens of those founders, their ideas. And she was challenging that. She was saying, you know what, we need to start thinking about the culture that surrounded those founders, not just what they were thinking in the specifics of the Constitution. So she was talking about women. She was talking about the institution of slavery. She was saying, look, originalism needs to be changed to be more inclusive in some ways. So thinking about today's conversation, I thought, oh, here we are. She's doing it once again. But then something really interesting happened, which is I'm a history nerd, and I was there with my sister, who's probably a bigger history nerd than I am, even though she's a lawyer. And we sat at the front, right? So we were down there close, right? We wanted to be there in the action. And we didn't realize that this whole cohort of people had come into the auditorium who were protesting the idea of changing the Constitution. And during the question and answer period, they were very upset about possibility, because one of the things that Jill Lepore suggested was that maybe we should do away with the Electoral College. And that got this cohort of people really upset. And one of them stood up and said, what you're advocating, right, in some way is exclusivity. Who's going to be making the decision now who's elected president? All those people in California and in the cities. And this group of people who were in there protesting were all white, by the way. Okay. And so the comment and everybody else cheered, the other people in this group. And I was just sitting there thinking, wow, this is really interesting, right? What they're complaining about is being excluded in some ways, right? Someone else is being included, but when you talk about inclusivity, other people's perception might be that that's exclusive, right? Even though the whole concept of inclusivity, as we're talking about it, means that we've gone from a position of being excluded, and now we're trying to include people. But there's a whole interesting dynamic that comes with this that has political implications today that we should keep in mind. And I know some of you are going to be mentioning some of these things. So that's just it was just last night. It was so obvious. And then this morning, right, those presentations that we just heard were so excellent about demonstrating the importance and significance of not just the research itself, not just inclusivity, but also rethinking how we think, right? That was really clear to me. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're just going to have a conversation. I will shut up, and we'll let these 4 experts talk. And we're going to just go in alphabetical order. Each one is going to spend about 5 minutes just talking about what diversity, inclusivity, and equity mean in their discipline, and then we will respond to each other. Okay, so John goes first.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Bartlett, and I'm the director of the fashion program. So when I joined Marist, it was April of 2020, and the world was literally shutting down. The students went away for spring break, never to come back until the next fall. And so what I was able to witness, while it was incredibly challenging for the students and the educators in the school, what I was able to witness really was a revelation. And what I got to experience was all of the capping students, the senior merchandisers, all present their ideas, their thesis, their final culmination of their work in this last semester. They do it each semester, but many of them were presenting this last semester in spring, as well as the senior designers who went away without getting to finish their final collections. And what I realized and witnessed across the board was that these students were presenting their work, which again is business plans and deep dives of corporate ideas, podcasts, gallery shows, conferences, startup ideas. They were presenting their ideas through the lens of social justice, and specifically with the thought of social inequality. The designers and merchandisers, the students that are focusing on promotion or product development, they were all talking about body positivity. They were talking about what it's like to be Black in the fashion industry. They're talking about disabled design. They're talking about clothing and wardrobes for trans people. They're also talking about environmental racism and all of these different things that are really topical, not only for students, but for our industry, for the fashion industry. And some of these capstone projects, for example, covered things like, for example, there was one called The Pure Truth Segregated by Design, and this was an honors thesis. And this was a student who created accessories reflecting America's forgotten history of redlining and its integral influence on the inequalities present in today's society. So this is a student who took their merchandising skill set, but applied it to the idea of redlining and how the student could in many ways reflect what was going on and what is still going on. Another group of students created a retail business model called Stealth. And this was designed to cater to the trans community and to provide wardrobes for those transitioning from male to female and female to male. And this was an award-winning business model that won many awards at the New York State Business Plan competition. Another group of senior merchandising students created a gender-fluid clothing line for a competition for the National Retail Federation. And this was a gender-fluid clothing line for Kohl's, and they were a semi-finalist team. So it's so interesting because while these students are learning about business, they're learning about Excel sheets, and they're learning about design and merchandising, all of these things. They are really approaching this through the lens of social justice. And that's one of the most exciting things that I found coming to Marist from the fashion industry. So while these students are really leading the way, I do believe that our program and the wonderful colleagues that I get to work with, that we are working equally as hard to try to, in many ways and in every way, reflect this idea that the students are really passionate about. So we're encouraging all of our faculty to really reassess and relook at all of their PowerPoints, all of their lectures. We're asking all of the faculty to inquire when each student comes into a first-year class, what are their pronouns? How do they want to be addressed? This is really, really important. And this is fairly new for us. And I have a lot of blind spots personally, and every day I'm learning more and more from both the faculty and from the students. We're encouraging our design students to learn to draw and illustrate all types of bodies and all types of skin color. And this comes from a world where traditionally all of the designers were illustrating bodies that were 8 feet tall, weighed 80 pounds, and were white. So we're really working to change the way students are seeing the world, and then in effect, change the way that the world is seeing fashion. So it's been not only a revelation, but also a revolution in my mind, coming from a fashion world where the standard of beauty for decades upon decades has been white, light-skinned, tall, thin, able-bodied, and clearly gender-defined. So it's very, very exciting to see what the students are talking about and thinking about. I also wanted to talk about 2 different initiatives that have happened in the fashion world over the last few years. One in particular is a group called Black in Fashion Council. So in 2018, the then editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue, Lindsay Peoples-Wagner, who we had as a guest here in the college a couple of years ago now, Lindsay Peoples-Wagner wrote an article about what it's like to be Black in fashion, and she interviewed over 100 different people in the industry to talk about what it's like to be Black in fashion. And so from that article stemmed an entire movement, and she and another partner created a group called Black in Fashion Council. And the idea behind this is to build a new foundation for inclusivity. For this to occur, non-Black brands, publications, and people of influence are asked to carefully examine their roles they've played in either helping or hurting Black people who work in these spaces. And I'd like to quote Lindsay because I think this is really important and indicative of the space that I'm working in and that my colleagues in fashion are working in. As an industry, we cannot continue to claim that we are progressive if we are not working to force diversity and inclusion in corporate structures while rectifying systemically racist policies that have permeated our industry for hundreds of years. And that's the thing. I think that a lot of people think about fashion and there's like a glossiness to it, and there is this idea of beauty, and it's very easy for companies and for brands to put people of color or underrepresented minority communities in their fashion shows and on their editorial pages. But the real challenge that Lindsay is asking for, that many people are asking for now, is how is this going to translate into getting people into retail spaces? How is this going to translate into getting BIPOC communities into the C-suites? And so that brings me to my other example. Another wonderful organization that was founded in 2020 is called the 15% Pledge. So in May of 2020, during the very charged and historical moment in our world, a designer, Aurora James, went on Instagram and said, "Okay, here's something that you can do for us." And she tagged all of the world's largest retail brands. And what she did is she asked for a fair Black representation on their shelves. And she's quoted as saying, "We represent 15% of the population, and we need to represent 15% of your shelf space." And her idea was to create a sustainable and supportive ecosystem for Black-owned businesses to succeed. And since she has started this organization, the 15% Pledge, over $10 billion of revenue has been diverted and brought into the world of Black-owned businesses. So it's really profound what's going on in the industry. So I had the privilege of teaching a first-year seminar, and which has been an amazing experience to get to work with first-year students. And the class that I teach is called Fashion and Social Justice. And I gave a lecture recently about African-American fashion, and it was the resistance fashion through the African-American lens. And it was really about the civil rights movement and all the different iterations and how people represented themselves during these protests. If you look at Martin Luther King and his colleagues, they were wearing their Sunday best. They were dressed beautifully. They were in coats and ties. And the women were in these beautiful dresses with pearls, and everything was very well done, very tasteful, but not ostentatious. But what was interesting was that there was a very clear gender definition between the men and the women of that particular group of protesters. Alongside this, there were a group of younger people coming from colleges that created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and they donned overalls because they were working in the Deep South and working to get sharecroppers registered to vote. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to reflect back and connect to the people that they were speaking to and who they were advocating for. What was interesting was that this group of people, in their dress and their overalls and denim, they created an environment where women and men were becoming more equal. The women cut their hair short, the men grew their hair out. This was during the mid and late 60s. And there was a much less defined gender definition. Alongside them, then we had the Black Panthers, and they had an incredible style, incredible uniform. And then the lecture that I gave ended with what people were wearing during the Black Lives Matter protests. And so it's been really wonderful to be able to connect the dots between fashion, social protest, and social justice. And the last thing I want to say is that, and I think all of my colleagues in fashion feel the same way, fashion is this wonderful opportunity and responsibility to affect change. And because we're all wearing clothing, and we all learn from each other about how we're dressed, or how a subgroup is dressed, or how a particular group of people are dressed. And clothing can help affect change. And so fashion is not just this sort of superficial thing that is very exclusive. It's becoming much more expanded. And what I'm seeing is that's coming from the students themselves. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, John. Hi, I'm Addrain, Conyers, Chair and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice. I'm going into my 5th year as being chair, which also means our program, and I've been chairing it during the heart of the civil unrest. And this is very important. I will lay out that criminal justice as a discipline is one of the biggest beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries of media coverage. For years running the program, how many times in an open house have students walk up to me and want to be a forensic psychologist, watching their favorite show from Law & Order to Criminal Minds to NCIS. I'm waiting for an NCIS in Poughkeepsie. It's gotten to that point. And it's huge, it's great, it's wonderful when the students are flocking up and I say, okay, I'll spend 4 years detoxing you, we'll straighten it out. However, when we get to the other side of the coin, when the events occur, we also feel that impact. And to say the least, the justice system has been incendiary when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have to be honest about that. Oppressive laws, incidents of biased law enforcement, inequitable practice, awaken public feelings of mistrust that sometimes can lay dormant, but nevertheless, they are there. And when these incidents happen, agitation occurs, public feelings arise. And what's important, particularly about our discipline in criminal justice, is that when these incidents occur, it spills out. And there are what I call aftershocks, that it affects everything, every place. No discipline, no field does not feel this. And it becomes a little problematic for a number of reasons as a discipline. First and foremost, the fact that I said these feelings are awakened or agitated means that they're already there. I hate to quote someone, but I'm gonna quote Will Smith. It might not be the best one, but he said racism's not occurring more, it's just being recorded more. This is very important when we look, particularly as educators and as a discipline. And what's problematic and very concerning is that academically, we know this. There's over 100 years of data that shows there's bias in the justice system. And frankly, it's embarrassing that it takes a tragic event for us to say, ooh, we need to do something different. Ooh, we need to go back and change the curriculum. Whereas academics and scholars, I can give you scholars from over 100 years that have documented that there's bias in our justice system. You can look at any major cases from the death penalty to the institutionalization of mental health to show that there's historical significance that documents this, yet we wait for a tragic event to occur. I was teaching about this recently in my capstone course, and I used the analogy with my students to say, if you're driving a car and you hear noise in the engine, what happens if you keep driving that car? They say, well, professor, well, the car's going to break down. I say, yep. And what's going to happen then? Oh, well, can't get to work? Nope. You're going to be late for class, which means you're going to fail. But the point is, you hear the noise, and if you don't do something, well, how are you going to view yourself? We're idiots then. They're like, They started saying, I said, so let's look at this. I'm going to give you 100 years of data that illustrates things. That noise has been occurring. So why does it take for a filming, somebody recording something from their phone to awaken you? As we use the term woke now. Why does it take this filming of different incidents to awaken you? We have to take some accountability. And in our discipline as educators, and particularly in our program, we say we have to take accountability. As educators, we know the data. We know it there. So why are we waiting for a tragic event to occur for change to happen? Therefore, we had to take a stance because indifference was not an option. Indifference means that we're going to let it continue the way it has been. And we have to take, in our program, in my wonderful faculty, we've taken a number of stances of being proactive. Because the problem is with all of this is a very reactive approach. And reactive means you're waiting for something bad to happen. We can be proactive when we have the data. We can be proactive when there's years, decades, a century of information. So I'm just going to highlight a few points, and then I'll let Steve talk about some things that we've done in our curriculum and program to make a difference. First and foremost, at the heart of it, we made DEI a learning outcome. And this is important because what it does is it puts the ownership back on us as faculty in the curriculum. That means that, you know what, we have to assess this now. We have to find places to assess it, and we have to develop tools to assess it. So therefore, no longer is it a side thing. No longer is this something that we're going to wait to happen. No, this is a fluid, dynamic aspect of our curriculum that we will continue to evolve. Second, and this is serious right here, we took taking time, and this is, this gets into academic freedom, which I'm well aware of decolonizing the curriculum. People have heard this term. But it comes down to where's your knowledge base coming from? Whose story are you telling? Particularly in criminal justice. Oh, the publishers love to flaunt who the author of the book is. This is a retired police officer of 20 years. I'm like, oh boy. Who has done this, that, X, Y, and Z. And I said, this is fine, but there are other sources of knowledge on how to do these things. Make sure our students, particularly if we are encouraging, cultivating critical thinkers, have other viewpoints and other perspectives. So the faculty have done a great job of reflecting that in terms of decolonizing the curriculum. The other thing is, making sure our faculty are ready to have this conversation. Make sure our faculty have the skill set, and we have open dialogue in terms of how to navigate these things, understanding that the wonderful thing about a college is that you have an expert in everything. There have been times I'll freak out about something and say, wait a second, there's a professor on campus who knows this. Why am I Googling this stuff? Let me call Dean Slater, ask about this biology thing. It makes no sense to me. And we figure it out. Another thing is also, once again, crucial is, language. Language. It's very concerning when you open a book, a textbook, and the terms they use, particularly in criminal justice, of calling individuals things, calling people things, what I call side dish approach to DEI. I mean, it's called justice. I don't understand how justice and equity are not connected. I don't understand how you separate the terms. And the last thing I'm going to hit on, in which we are very aware of, is that DEI, which is a hot topic now, has become politicized and weaponized. And I'd say that with a sense of urgency. It's become politicized and weaponized. And when it becomes to that thing, when it gets to that point, it's used to hurt. It's used to strike fear. It's used to cause moral panics. And when we are teaching in our curriculum and bringing awareness to students, I mean, listen, I have a running joke, and I'm just going to say it because I say it to all my students. When the news reports them, I said, listen, is this capstone to seniors? I said, I will never see you in the news. They say, what are you talking about? I said, because I'm going to be in your head. I said, let me tell you right now, when you pull somebody over, when you're thinking about that sentence, I said, yes, that bald black man is going to be in the back of your head from 20 years ago. And you will think twice. All right, thank you.
Steve, I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second because I just want to piggyback on what you just said. The first-year seminar students who are in this here today, many of you are here, read a book, and our first-year seminar director, Patty Tarantello, is here also. Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, and in some ways, that story is exactly what you described, right? There's been 100 years, there's been 200 years of this stuff, and finally, what he did was he went around and looked at public history sites and said, how has the story been told? Who is telling the story, and who is not actually telling the story? And if we can recalibrate our vision, we will see a more complete picture. And it's not about, from his perspective, it's about being smart, right? If you're going to understand it, you have to have an inclusive recognition of what is causing change and what also is out there that we're all perceiving, especially in the public history realm. So he went to Monticello, he went to Angola Prison in Louisiana, he went to these places and looked into it, and that's what our first year seminar, and I think it speaks exactly to your suggestion, right? We have to start thinking about these things and recognizing that they're out there and broadening our minds, right? And I think the first year seminar is one of those places where Marist is really addressing this. Steve.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me if I do it like this? All right. Fair enough. Hello. My name's Steve Garabedian. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and I'm going to be speaking to Nick's favorite discipline, the discipline of history. All disciplines are created equal, though. I do want to make sure I say that today. Even math. I also wanted to say, if my teeth chatter, I am nervous, admittedly, and anyone would be in a situation like this, but it's because I'm freezing. I don't know if anyone can see my body shaking, but okay. For our purposes today, I was thinking that we could divide the discipline of history, break it down into 4 elements, all right? Research, evidence, thesis, knowledge. And some might assume the action stops at knowledge, but no. The action does not stop at knowledge. The action continues with storytelling. That knowledge has to get out, and that's a point you've been making, Addrain. That's a point you were just making as well, Nick. There is an historian whose book I've used on occasion named John Arnold, who calls history true stories about the past. In this light, the positive impact of DEI in my discipline, I think, could be summed up with 2 questions. First, who is afforded the authority and the visibility to tell true stories about our past? And second, what stories get told? The discipline of history has benefited from diversification, greater inclusivity, and attention to equity, justice, and accountability, both in terms of curriculum, that is to say the stories told, and personnel, who gets to tell these stories. The inclusion of women, people of color, attention to working class people, gay people, trans folks, attention to social and political dissenters and activists in the true stories about our past is not a special interest agenda. It's not special interest history. It's just an attempt at better, more inclusive history. A great storyteller, James Baldwin, wrote in a talk to teachers in 1963, "American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it." So this is an issue of representation. As my students hear me say all the time in class, history is the representation of the past. In a perfect world, what happened back then and how it is represented would match up perfectly. But we live in an imperfect world. 50 or 100 years ago, traditional storytelling in history was narrow and lopsided in its representation in terms of both the stories told and the storytellers. It was Eurocentric, male-centric, and class-bound, as if the voices and activities of a subset of the population, of European American men of some considerable economic means, was a universal truth for us all. DEI in my discipline is about writing that narrow and lopsided focus, and it's been a long process. In our current polarized national conversation, this has led to explosive debates, for instance, over the 1619 Project. And I bought this explosive tome with me. What story should be told about the origin of the United States of America, and who has the authority to tell that story? Should we start in 1776, or should we start in 1619, for instance? In my own experience, I can relate that representation, that is to say, who is given the mantle of authority and what stories they tell, is at a new premium. I'm a contributor to a collection of essays on folk and popular music in the United States that is currently in the works. From what I understand, some of the younger academics who have been recruited for involvement, folks from all different backgrounds, just embarking on their careers, have set a standard for the editor. They've asked deliberately how many women, how many scholars of color will be included as storytellers in this book. And they've made it clear that the tradition of underrepresentation of the past must end and a higher standard of inclusivity must prevail, or they will not participate. I applaud this call to balance the scales of history, and I hope I can do right by it in my own teaching and scholarship. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, I'm Lisa Stevens, and I'm a chemistry professor, and I also serve as the coordinator for our pre-health program here. And so today, my talk is actually more about healthcare, and I'm very honored and feel very privileged to be up here with this panel today. So I'm going to start with a story. It's a story of someone who is one of my all-time heroes. His name is Vivian Thomas. Does anybody out there know who Vivian Thomas is? Oh, good. It'll be a new story for everybody then. Right, so Vivian Thomas was born in 1910. He was the grandson of enslaved persons. And in the 1920s, as a teenager and becoming a young adult, he decided he was going to be a doctor. He saved up his money, put it in the bank, and what happened toward the end of the 1920s? As a first-year pre-med student, everything he saved was lost. Everything. So he left school and he found a job working with Dr. Blaylock, Alfred Blaylock. And he was working as a research assistant. And Dr. Blaylock was a fairly well-known physician at Vanderbilt, I believe, at the time, and he was studying surgical, he was studying how to recover from the stress of like blood loss, right? And so Vivian Thomas worked with him for years, and they were so successful that Johns Hopkins University started headhunting Blaylock and said, Alfred, come and be our chief of surgery. And Dr. Blaylock said, I will, but only if I can bring Vivian Thomas with me. And they agreed. So Alfred Blaylock and Vivian Thomas went off to Johns Hopkins, where Alfred Blaylock was the chief of surgery there. And while there, and they were continuing research, pulmonary-related research, a female physician, another almost unheard of thing in the 1940s, right? A female physician approaches the chief of surgery and says, we have these problems with babies and toddlers dying very young from heart disease, right? The blue baby syndrome, if anybody of you have heard of that. And she convinced Dr. Blaylock to look into surgical procedures that were unheard of at the time to try to save these babies. Now, Vivian Thomas's role in this is that as the research assistant, he did this surgery. He basically created the technical parts of this surgery, how to do this surgery, doing it over and over and over again on hundreds of dogs to make sure that they would live. He even created the tools that could be used because the tools that were available were much too big for a baby's heart. He did all of that, and the surgery started happening. That first surgery was Dr. Blaylock as the head surgeon, Dr. Helen Tossig there as an associate surgeon, Dr. Cooley, who was a resident at the time, and believe it or not, Vivian Thomas standing on a crate at the shoulder of Dr. Blaylock because he wanted him there. And he was in that surgery room, honestly, much to the surprise and sadly to the disgust of people because there was a black man in the operating room of a white baby. So the surgery was a success. You know, the baby lived longer than expected. The first baby didn't live as long as they had hoped, but hundreds and thousands of these procedures saved babies at Johns Hopkins alone. So, of course, Dr. Blaylock, Dr. Tossig, and Dr. Cooley were, they had articles written about this surgery, and articles written about them. Took decades before anybody knew who Vivian Thomas was. Decades. So now it's been almost 100 years since Vivian Thomas was an inspiring pre-med student. And sadly, he never did make it to medical school. He spent his life as a researcher because he realized there was benefit to the world in doing what he did as a researcher. But again, 100 years ago, he was an aspiring pre-med student. And statistically speaking, as a percentage of medical students in school, he would have been as nearly as likely to be in medical school in the 1940s as a black man as he would be today, 100 years later. Now, of course, I could go into all the different reasons why this is, and we could have a whole course that would talk about the legacy of Jim Crow laws, redlining, and just the history of American policy before, during, and since the Civil War, but that's not my talk, right? And I can talk statistics all day. I can go and pull out the research that I've done, but it's not about statistics and numbers because in all of those statistics, those are people, right? People who are dying early. People who have worse health outcomes because of the lack of diversity in our healthcare system. So I have a couple more stories I wanted to share, a little more contemporary. The Latino grandfather who has to take his minor grandson with him to a doctor's appointment because there's not a doctor who can speak Spanish. let alone a doctor available to him that has any firsthand understanding of what culture or ethnicity might be contributing to his health care. Further, that grandfather is now having to rely on his grandchild to relay personal and intimate medical information to his doctor. And how about the young gay woman who goes in for her checkup? At some point, it's very likely that the doctor is just going to automatically ask you, is your boyfriend using a condom? And who does she have to ask to discuss women's health issues and sexual health issues that may be different because she is a gay woman and not a straight woman? Who are the doctors out there who have that firsthand knowledge? And there are women who die from heart attacks because sometimes women's symptoms are much more subtle and different than men's. But healthcare providers are primarily trained on how men present with a heart attack. Things like diagnostic tests have been designed by men based on male bodies. How about the patients out there with darker hued skin, where there are very few medical illustrations out there that show what an illness looks like on dark skin as opposed to white skin, so things go undiagnosed. And those are just a few examples. We could probably, again, come up all day with a variety of examples to share of how diversity is directly affecting the healthcare of people in this country. But the good news is this: I know all of that because the healthcare field is learning all of that, right? Health profession schools nationwide are looking to diversify their student body, right? Their student body can be more diverse when our student body can be more diverse. All of this helps to increase equity and inclusion for people nationwide. And of course, it's not earth-shattering news because if we didn't know this, the four of us wouldn't be sitting up here with Nick moderating at this panel. I know that my colleagues here really want students to be successful. We want you to be successful in your studies and to go on and make your dreams come true, whether it be medical school, telling stories of history, making a difference in fashion, changing things in criminal justice, or any other major out there you can dream of. And so, to my faculty, to the administrators and colleagues, and to all of the board members and everybody here who are here to support education and to provide education, I want to say, in addition to being excellent educators and supporters, be that ally, be the mentor, be that person that a student can come to when they don't feel like they belong, for whatever that reason is, and let them know that they belong. And I know there are students out here, and I have a message for you too. That message is, you belong here. However you define your identity, you belong here, and you being here makes this place a better place. Work hard, reach for your dreams, whatever they might be. Make the best of your dreams come true, because in the end, you will make this world a better place. Thank you.
So when we first got together to talk about this panel, we were concerned that each person would take only 5 minutes, and then we wouldn't know where to go with the rest of the 25 minutes that was left over to make it to 11:45. Wrong, right? You guys all went way over. But that's okay, that's okay. But I think maybe just to sum up a little bit, there's a couple of themes here. One of them is one of kind of optimism, right? About changes. John, right? I had no idea about those things in fashion. Addrain, right? We're talking about optimism, but at the same time, we're recognizing these barriers that are still there, and the same thing that you're talking about, Lisa. And Steve, in history, I think we really feel like we're in a new place. We're in a better place as a field. So it's both recognizing that this is working to help us as we move forward, but at the same time, there are all these barriers that are making it difficult, right? And that's what we got to do, right, moving forward. Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.